So welcome today to our session on Dickinson Scholars in Conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. We are very fortunate to have two of our most distinguished scholars in conversation today about a famous Dickinson poem, After Great Pain. As critics and scholars, Jane Eberwein and Suzanne Juhasz have provided a formidable and highly regarded series of interpretations of Dickinson's poetry from varying critical perspectives. And as was mentioned this morning, one of our goals going forward in EDIS will be to create a living archive or history of conversations by distinguished scholars in which they provide literary interpretations and models for critical approaches of individual poems, both for general readers as well as teachers and students alike. We hope eventually to post these on a YouTube channel and continue to build what will become a living history of scholars from this generation and continuing, we hope, to gather some of the best work by those scholars. And now to introductions. Jane Donahue Eberwein has been working on several projects since retiring from Oakland University in 2007. Those include co-editing, reading Emily Dickinson's letters with Cindy MacKenzie, and Dickinson in her own time with Stephanie Farrar and Cris Miller. And that's a book I've already used in my work, and I'm sure others have as well. A recent project has been an essay on Dickinson's relationship with Amherst's First Congregational Church that will appear in the Emily Dickinson Handbook, being edited by Cris Miller and Karen Sanchez-Epler. Suzanne Juhasz is Professor of English Emerita, University of Colorado at Boulder. Suzanne was one of the founding members of the Emily Dickinson International Society and the founding member of the Emily Dickinson Journal. She has many books to her credit, including most recently a memoir entitled Discovering Senior Space, a memoir. She is also author of many distinguished feminist critical interpretations, including The Undiscovered Continent, Emily Dickinson and the Space of Mind, Comic Power in Emily Dickinson, which was co-written with Cris Miller and Martha Nell Smith, A Desire for Women, Language, Psychoanalysis, and Writing Between Women, and Reading from the Heart, Women, Writing, and the Search for True Love. So I'd like now to welcome both Jane and Suzanne and invite them to engage in conversation for about a half an hour, and then we'll open the dialogue to questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Jane?
Well, when we have talked about this session, Suzanne and I thought we might begin by giving a little bit of perspective, each of us, on how we got into Dickinson scholarship. We actually began our publication of Dickinson books back in the 1980s, very close together. There's 2 books, 2 years ahead of my Strategies of Limitation. So we're thinking of telling a little bit about how we got to doing Dickinson work at that time, and what kind of critical perspectives we brought with us and have examined or re-examined, and then apply them to this poem, After Great Pain. So Suzanne, why don't you give us your very brief life story?
Okay. Well, so I got my PhD in 1960, and at that time, what I liked the most of what we did was we could be called formalism or new criticism, and which most of you know was very close attention to the work of art itself. And we knew they were real people, we knew they lived in real time, but the works themselves, the authors of the works themselves, and the works were of prime importance, and the language, which meant a lot to me because I love language above and beyond. And my dissertation was on metaphor in modern Lang poems. And so the formalism was very much to my liking. And I've always done that no matter what I've done. When I started out, I wasn't a feminist. Nobody even talked about women writers. I am one of the people who did ask my professor, are there any women writers? And any women poets? So I am one of the first feminist critics. But I started on Dickinson before I did feminism and just added that in. So I guess that's really all I have to say. So that's what I'll be thinking about this afternoon.
Okay, my background, when I was an undergraduate, certainly what was called the new criticism, or what Suzanne is speaking of as formalism, was the dominant mode of literary analysis, was what one learned. Although I would say in my case, in terms of my education, it was a matter of practice rather than principle, and not something one felt greatly committed to. And when I was graduating from college, I found that the authors who interested me the most, people like William Bradford and Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Emily Dickinson and Robert Lowell, people like this, all were connected in some way with Puritan past, a Puritan tradition, which I guess was of interest to me as a New Englander. So I wound up in, not in an English graduate program precisely, but American Civilization at Brown, with an interest in cultural contextualization, emphasizing history and religion, or perhaps more especially the history of religion in relation to literature. And when I started teaching, it was early American literature chiefly, and the writers I was writing on were pretty much the ones I have mentioned, Anne Bradstreet, Nathaniel Hawthorne especially. I always knew that Dickinson would be one of them. My problem with Dickinson is I couldn't figure out a way to write articles about her. And I didn't have Suzanne's impulse toward the book. And so, but everything connects with Dickinson. Everything connected then, everything still connects. And so she is a wonderful author for writers interested in contextualization. So that is my background. I was a little surprised when Strategies of Limitation came out to find it was being reviewed as a feminist book, because I hadn't particularly identified myself as that, but certainly was proud of being a woman scholar working on it with a woman writer, as I had also worked with Bradstreet. So this is our background, and we bring these dispositions as readers to After Great Pain. And Suzanne did not mention, but she's also a performer and a wonderful reader. So we would like to launch this discussion with Suzanne doing a reading of After Great Pain, and then we can start talking about it.
Okay, we will. And I wanted to say something in my introduction, which is that probably everybody in this room has written on this poem at one time or another. So if Jane and I have a conversation, we can have a conversation with everybody else, because you'll all have your interpretation of it. Okay, here's the poem. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round, a wooden way of ground or air or aught. Regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Okay, that's the poem. And I will talk about it first. So when I was thinking about doing it today, I said to myself, I've written about this poem about 1,000 times. What do I have to say about it? Do I have any problems with it? And I thought of two that were very important, and they were real questions. And the first has to do with the figurative language, because of course, this poem is a great poem. One of the great poems, it's definitely one of the important poems with figurative language, because I don't think there's any part of the poem, except maybe the first half of the first line, that isn't figurative. So I want to just think about it a little bit. It is because it's the most outstanding feature of the poem. And of course, it's one of the exciting parts about the poem because there are so many figures. But on the other hand, it might seem, and this is what I began to think, that there is a surplus of figures in such a short poem. If so, why? To what effect? And that's my first question. Why do you have to have so many of them? And my second question relates to the first. Why is that generic person, there may be one, who had experienced great pain? Why is he or she, why is the person dissected into parts? Here are nerves, heart, feet, throughout the poem. When this is a poem about internal feeling, which is not physical, this too is figure. It's synecdoche, the use of body parts to represent the person's feelings. So more figurative language. So those are my questions. What does she gain from it? So let's think about how it works. The heart questions, and it's a stiff heart after so much suffering. Okay, I can go with that. The feet go round. Their path may be wooden or ground or air or aught, whatever that means. I never could find that. They're confused, and I am too. The important thing here may be the confusion itself. The feet are now regardless. They experience a quartz contentment. Quartz, stiff like quartz. Another simile inside the more general simile of stone, quartz. So my description just now, which I had to write down, I was just going to talk it, but it's too many metaphoric parts. My description shows how the metaphors and similes and even synecdoche meld into one another. Everything is figure piled upon figure. And then comes the final stanza, which changes the controlling metaphor once again to snow. And this that I've just gone through, I think, is why it is impossible for me to tell from the last word whether the person dies or lives, or indeed what happens during letting go. Life, death, a different kind of life. The final stanza itself is really a dramatic simile for the first stanza, for the first line of the first stanza. This is the hour of lead. If the person has survived all these moments of consciousness, then the analogy is now to snow, chill, even stupor. If the person has undergone all of this, then letting go may be possible. What is that? Actually dying, coming to a clearer consciousness? There is too much metaphor here for me to know, I suggest. The surplus of figure makes the answer impossible, and especially that dash. This is why the dash is there, I think, perhaps. So that's what I think about surplus of figure. That's it.
Thank you. That is, you have certainly zeroed in on crucial parts of this poem that we're going to have a lot of fun talking about, I think. I would like to start from a different angle, having said that my impulse is to contextualize. So just think about what kinds of context one can put this poem in, because the actual situation, as Suzanne is mentioning to us, is so abstract. We don't know who the speaker, well, the speaker's situation may not be that of the subject. It is a very general, abstract statement of situation, and yet there so much is vivid in the middle part of the poem. But if you think about, what kind of great pain could lead to this sort of total, traumatic division of body from mind, that seems to be happening here. A body in rebellion, a body unable to report what it's experiencing. Historically, one could think of it with perhaps remembering, as Shira Wolofsky called our attention to, this is during the Civil War. Dickinson must have known about some extremes of anguish and physical pain. As George Mamounis has reminded us, it's a time of tremendous numbers of losses to tuberculosis. But I don't think we have to put it in a context of its time. I can't read it today without thinking of the poor souls in intensive care units right now, suffering from the coronavirus, helpless to, probably unconscious of what is happening. They're living between life and death. Whatever happens is nothing that they can control. Some will live, some will die, but it's outside their control. So, it's a poem that seems to speak to extreme agony in any time. And I think about another kind of context. When I was in graduate school, I was studying with Hyatt Wagoner at the time. He was writing American poets and arguing that Emily Dickinson represents a kind of conversation or argument with both Puritans, as represented to her by her father in the religious community in which she lived, and also Emerson and transcendentalism. So I was geared to think in those terms, and and certainly the thought of circle, circumference, the Emersonian figures of speech come to mind here. This is very much, I don't care what you call it, circumference or limitations or boundaries, whatever you call it. This is a poem about it being at the extreme end of consciousness, the extreme end of something. I got to thinking, well, where does Emerson come in this poem? Strangely enough, the only thing that reminds me of Emerson in this poem is the quartz contentment like a stone. Any of you who have been to Sleepy Hollow Burying Ground in Concord, Massachusetts, might remember that Emerson's gravestone is rose quartz, but this poem was written decades before he died. Not written with that in mind, but somehow that always, I think of Emerson when I see that phrase. And the other person who comes to mind, we are talking about, as Hyatt Wagoner did, the debate between the Puritans and Emerson, is Jonathan Edwards. And a very early reflection written when he was in college at Yale, he spoke about the impossibility of thinking of nothingness. And in a way, that's what this poem is trying to do, think about nothing. And he said it is to think of what the sleeping rocks dream of.
Oh, that's good.
Or a situation in which all the principles of Euclid are neither true nor untrue. And it seems as though Dickinson is getting at that sensibility. I think also of the context, and some of my friends here in the Dickinson Society will be very happy to hear this. I think of the context of the fascicle in which the order in which they appear in the manuscript books. As Suzanne said, we have this problem. Does this person live or die? Which would even be a good resolution of the problem might be a question. Is it better to live or die? And the very next poem begins that yeah, the very next poem is "This world is not conclusion," which seems wonderfully, encouraging after this poem, until you keep reading in "This world is not conclusion," and you become less and less confident, and the species stands beyond. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The poem doesn't show us. And the very final poem in the Fascicle is one I like to think of with it, because Dickinson, we know from our teaching, people think about Dickinson as expressing the really horrible things in the mind and in human experience. And we have to remember that she's also a poet of exaltation and breaks the boundaries of consciousness in terms of joy as well as anguish. And the very last poem is "Better Than Music."
Can't hear you.
It's such a wonderful poem about how music is probably the most extraordinary expression of human art and joyousness, or potential for joyousness. And this is better than music. It is some sort of foretaste of heaven. So we have a poem like "After Great Pain" that seems so caught up in despair or seeming despair, and then "Better Than Music" for I who heard it. And in that case, there is an I. In this poem, in "After Great Pain," there isn't an I. You don't know whether she's speaking for herself or for others. I was interested, Suzanne, in what you said about the references to the bodily organs in this poem. I find myself quite fascinated by what they do and don't do. And
What did you
wondered
say?
if you wanted to comment more. I mean, you've got the heart, which we have great pain, of formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious, like that. They're just sitting.
Yeah.
They are doing nothing. They are conveying no information. And the feet mechanical go round, and but they're not getting anywhere.
No.
In fact, when I think of this cultural contextualization, one thing I looked up recently was, when were wind-up mechanical toys invented? Because when I read this poem, I'm afraid I always think of something that's kind of a comic image, but when she says the feet mechanical go round of ground or air or art, I find myself thinking about wind-up dog among my childhood toys that would launch it, wind it up, and send it on its way, and it would hit a chair leg or it would hit a wall and it would tumble over and still keep moving, but going nowhere. And that's my image of what the feet mechanical go round. Apparently such toys were devised in the 19th century, but I don't know just when or just where. So I'm curious about that. And the stiff heart questions. So it's the heart isn't doing what the heart should do, it's doing what the brain should do. And the brain's not mentioned here.
That's right.
It's just, and how could it function? It isn't getting any neural impulses because the nerves are sitting, and it isn't getting any circulation of blood, so it's incapable of doing anything at all. That's how it seems to me. And what do you make of those images? Yeah, I was interested you zeroed in on them.
I think, Suzanne, did you have an answer to that? or a thought about that? And we're getting close to the point where we could probably open this up.
Well, I think that one of the things I try to say is that the body parts that she mentioned, I think they're not themselves alone. They stand, the three of them, for the whole body. And also, every actor in the poem stands for itself and the opposite of itself at the same time. That's how the figures of speech work, so that nothing is simple. And I think that's one of the things that I was stumbling around about, is that she doesn't just say, okay, nobody can feel anything. She says, and I can't do it. They feel because they feel because they feel because they, and it keeps on twisting everything around itself. And that's either the good or the evil part of the poem, I don't know.
One of the things that's always interesting, this may be something for general discussion as well, because Suzanne said most of you have written on this poem, probably have thought about it a lot. Many of you have taught it or have been in classes where it was being discussed. And I know when I've asked students what they think, what sort of pain they can imagine that would justify this kind of description, it's always interesting what people come up with, given that college students are given concerns of their lives. Disappointment in love certainly comes up as a suggestion many times, and grief over someone's death also comes up. Nervous breakdown with that. Other people can probably come up with more.
My students always said one of two things, always. I would say, what is the poem about? And they would say death or love, always. But it's not about them, it's about the pain that something caused. That's what the poem is about. But that's the two things they always said.
Yeah, they want to have a context.
That's right, Jane. That's right, exactly. And I'm trying to say it doesn't. That's the scary part about it. That when the person walking around asks questions, they don't get. He or she does not get an answer for a context. It's just pain. That's worse.
Yes. I'm struck by some of the words. One of the words in this poem that I found myself thinking about and checking both concordances for was stupor. I was thinking, does Dickinson refer to stupor anywhere else? And she does, but certainly not much. It is a key word in this poem. It's an unusual poem. And the first reference is in a letter to Jane Humphrey from 1850, so that's quite early. And she talks about it in terms of missing out on something that was really good. She's writing to Jane, her friend, because Jane is away teaching, and Emily misses her. And she thinks back to the summer before, when Jane had been in Amherst, and maybe they didn't spend as much time together as they should have, given that circumstance. She said, "It seemed so pleasant to have you, to know that I might see you, that I sank into a kind of stupor." Into a kind of stupor of with happiness, actually. And didn't know or care or think that I could not see you always. So she fell into a kind of stupor and failed to take advantage of this happy moment. And then the word appears in one other poem. Did our best moment last? So, I mean, After Great Pain is certainly not a best moment, but But there are some best moments, and the word appears there too. Did our best moment last? 'Twould supersede the heaven. A few, and they by risk procure. So this sort are not given, except as stimulants in cases of despair or stupor. The reserve these heavenly moments are. So heavenly moments are held in reserve in cases of despair or stupor to keep people going. So stupor comes to mind. You know, it's a grant of the divine that certain as it comes withdraws and leaves a dazzled soul in her unfurnished room. So, you know, it is a word that she uses very seldom, but I think it's especially meaningful here.
Okay, I think what seems so interesting, and I'd like to open things to discussion, is that you both bring a different critical kind of approach and almost to the reading of these poems, a different apparatus. I mean, and Jane in particular, yours is contextual, historical contextualism, as you're suggesting. And Suzanne's approach is based in new formalism. And it's a very different sort of theoretical approach. You know, one is looking at the evidence intrinsic to the poem and working through the figuration, and another is looking to external sources that might shed light on the poem. And I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts about what leads you to those particular approaches, or alternately, what those particular approaches allow you to develop in your readings.
Good question.
And then others feel, and then if others wish to ask or pose questions, feel free, and I'll be reading.
I'll try one that just seems really obvious. I'm a poet.
Right.
Not anymore, actually. I stopped. I've been writing prose instead, but I am a writer. So I think about how the words work.
Yes.
All the time. I can't stay away from that. So I can talk now about many other things, many other aspects of life that have to do with the poem that I'm talking about, but I can't get away. Are the words working? And I forgot some of the words. That makes me feel bad. But I did this for today. I didn't talk about all of them. So maybe that's a simple answer, but that's what I would say.
Well,
yes, go ahead,
I
Jane.
would certainly never quarrel with Suzanne about the supreme importance of the words. That's why we're interested in Emily Dickinson, the language. That's what she did with language. But I am interested in placing her in a context of her time and her culture. I think actually the most important context I find, I know the most important context I find with Dickinson is with her other writings. It really seems important to me to read a poem not simply alone. And sometimes it's something else in the, say, the fascicle, the grouping, or something else that uses a particular word or expresses a concept. Speaking of words, Cris Miller has given me a new vocabulary word today, or a new phrase. So thank you, Cris, for that, as well as for many other things. But she referred to have the prose, what we think of as prose fragments. That's how they appear in Johnson's letters. But now they are becoming retained prose. Okay, so here's a wonderful prose fragment or piece of retained prose. It seems to me pertinent to this poem, and I would love it if Cris and Donald, in the process of their edition, are able to provide a context for me, somehow connected to something else, because it seems to me pertinent to this poem. She writes in this prose fragment, "'Tis a dangerous moment for anyone when the meaning goes out of things and life stands straight and punctual, and yet no signal comes." Doesn't that sound like what's happening with these bodily organs failing to signal each other and respond to each other as they should? Yet such moments are. If we survive them, they expand us. If we do not, but that is death. Whose if the last. Of course, that's a big if that's in many of her poems. I think one of the fascinations of death is precisely, for her, is precisely that great if, the questions of what lies beyond, if anything lies beyond, and her imagination keeps trying to project there. And After Great Pain shows us a point where that projection stops. You cannot push beyond this particular moment unless something frees up. But the being going through it is unable to make anything happen, anything change, anything improve.
Okay, we have that. I think we can open things now to questions because we have several hands that have been raised and also comments in chat. So I'm going to try to get to all of them. And we start with Emily Seelbinder.
So as someone who's also taught this poem many times and read it aloud for students, one of the things that keeps coming back to me in listening to it is sound. The alliteration, the way in which the words slow down, that you can't, it's not a poem that you can read fast. And I have found myself, since the Franklin edition came out, stumbling in the middle stanza over a wooden way.
You too?
Oh, absolutely. Because the transposition that apparently he put it right, although to my ear, having read it so many times, the feet mechanical go round of ground or air or ought. That round, ground, air, ought. There's a kind of haunting quality to the vowels there that changes. And I realize that wooden has that O sound, but I've often stumbled over that. I understand this notion of a wooden way as being perhaps both wooded and also that wooden movement. But it does seem to me in that middle stanza, there's an awful lot going on that has to do with emptiness and opaqueness. Suzanne, you asked about ought.
Yeah, how do you understand?
I read it as the opposite of not.
Not?
In other words,
As
not.
AUGHT.
So the opposite of nothing.
Oh, that's
being
it?
something, what you ought. In a Cockney way, someone would say it's ought, it's something, and that's a possibility. But I also wonder about quartz contentment, because I spent a lot of time thinking about quartz and what the symbolism of quartz might be. But I keep coming back to sound, to quartz contentment, that and in my ear as well as in my mind's eye, it's a false contentment. It's the appearance of contentment without the underlying calm that would accompany actual contentment.
Would you like to I would, as you talk, I'm put together ceremonious like tombs, that same conjunction. That really is not very unusual.
And can I suggest that in the interest of time, because we have we have now so many people asking questions.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that we do, that everyone pose a question if you have one. And you might also want to put those sorts of alternate readings in chat, because we'll save the chat and go from there. Those are, I think we have a number of people asking questions just like that. From Dan Mannheim, we had a question, because you've talked so much about individual words in these poems, he'd like to hear you think a little bit about the use of the word formal and why that comes after great pain.
Right, yes, good. You're asking me?
Sure.
Oh, I didn't know you wanted to put it in chat. Because, actually the whole poem is about formalism. Not formalism in the sense that I use it as a way of doing an analysis, but the whole poem is interested in the way form is constricting. It keeps doing that. That's why maybe you get quartz contentment, because quartz is all of the tightness of the metal and the wood, and something like that. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but it's concerned. It's concerned about having all this feeling and not being able to let it loose until maybe the last line.
Yes, it's just, I always think about that with this poem, because the form is odd and it seems to be trying to find a form. And then depending on how you read it, it ends in a line of iambic pentameter of all things.
Yes.
As though it's found its proper form, which was the form that she never wanted to find. So but I don't know. I don't.
I like that. Where do you go with it?
I don't know.
That's it.
We also have a question from Juan Calvillo. Juan, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Just going back to individual words, I would like to hear your thoughts on grown. I hope it's not a naive question. Do you read that word or those that line in the middle stanza as grown regardless, and that's straightforward, or could you read it also as grown regardless, or regardless grown, as separate things? And I ask this because there is no translation for grown in Spanish. You have to say turned regardless.
Oh.
But if you say grown, you have to, you imply that it gets bigger, of course. So I don't know if it's that straight interpretation of grown regardless, or it allows for a different reading.
Okay. Regardless, a wooden way of grown here. It also rhymes with ground.
And sort of echoes the sound of ground, yes. But regardless, grown, yeah, having grown. I mean, you could read that in several different ways, can't you? I mean, it has grown regardless of any plan, or it has grown to be regardless of not heeding, not paying attention.
I think.
But it's a wooden way, isn't it, that has become regardless? And how do we make sense of that? I mean, it shouldn't have any kind of intellective power. Wouldn't expect it to.
The chat is overflowing with readings.
Wonderful.
So we are growing the reading.
That's what I was trying to say. That's my whole little talk, is how can we decide what it means?
Yes.
And is that good or is that bad?
Yes, of course.
I think what you said is interesting, because it's very interesting to see what translations you have to give to make it. Yeah, I liked your first one better.
And I find myself going back to Emily's point about ought, because it seems to me it can mean A-U-G-H-T, N-A-U-G-H-T, sort of anything or nothing, or ought
Exactly.
in the sense of moral obligation. One keeps going because one must, because one should, no matter what pain one.
Right.
That seems to me very much.
We have another question. If we can turn to Melanie Hubbard. Melanie, are you there with us?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, Jane was asking about another context for the poem, and I want to relate it to the formal considerations as well. Suzanne asks, you know, why are there so many figures? There's a philosophical project that Dickinson is sort of well into in her schooling with Thomas Upham and Thomas Brown and Alexander Bain, and all these folks are trying to think about how sensation is processed and how to name, especially emotions or internal sensation, you might say, or what is the relationship between language and thought. And I think her test case is definitely those unnameable emotions are the things that don't have words. And that what that does is produce metaphor as kind of the ground of, or the no ground of thought.
Yes.
We're all sort of agreeing to sort of point vaguely. In fact, Thomas Upham says, well, if you don't know how to say something, point to the experience. You know, it's like being on a sailboat or something. But if you don't have an experience to point to, you're left generating metaphors. And Thomas Brown makes much of this. He says in the heat of emotion, like the heat of a passion, we generate more metaphors, you know, trying to express. And I think this is really Dickinson's happy place. You know, I think she really is, wants to explore this question and put a fine point on it, you know, with these unnameable emotions. So I'll leave it there.
That's good. Very good.
That's another fascinating point, and it's I hope you'll continue to put these responses in chat, because as both Dan and I noticed, we have a tremendous just growth of approaches to these particular poems and this poem and these words. Nancy, our longtime secretary at EDIS.
Okay. This poem has always struck me as being about depression, because it's like has a formal feeling. It's like the feelings have been turned off rather than on. A quartz contentment, an hour of lead, freezing, all these hard chills, stupor. And I always visualize a film I saw about Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt when Franklin died in his lover's arms, and the way the actress portrayed Eleanor, and it seemed like she was in shock, but yet she had to put on a formal performance. But yeah, my experience has been depression is a lot like this. And that would be depression for her too, to discover that her husband was still seeing his lover. So, thank you.
There's so many things people can think of, and you know that is certainly seems on target. But I think it varies almost by the day or the reading, how what one would see as the occasion for this poem. Just part of the fascination of it. We go back quickly to that point Emily made about the order of the lines. I was happy to find out there's somebody else like me who still has problems with that movement.
Jane, we're just stick in the mud. We're just
sticking them up. Yeah, the problem, you know, if I had just recited this poem, the odds are that it would have come out the way it was, frankly, in my childhood, and then with the Johnson edition. I would not, it has never seemed right to me since. And yet I look and I don't see that it changes the meaning very much, or if at all. It doesn't disturb things. I was sort of hoping that the Miller edition would restore it to rights, but it didn't.
She makes
Very clear.
note
You
of-
look at the manuscript books. You look at the manuscript, and it's very clear that Emily Dickinson renumbered those lines.
she has a note in which she talks about it being transposed,
Yeah,
that Johnson transposed it.
right. But he did it on the basis of what looked like Emily Dickinson's signature.
We have another question, Adalberto Müller.
Hi, I'd like to thank you very much for the presentations. And this was one of the most difficult poems to translate, because I translated all the poems according to Cris Miller's edition. And I want to thank Jane Eberwein very much for putting the poem in the context of the fascicle, because there's also the problem of rhythm. If you consider this poem in the fascicle, the rhythm changed completely. There are longer lines than most of the poems. But inside this fascicle, the last poem that Jane read, there's the problem of translation, better than music. How to translate this feeling of dying? How is it possible? And I always thought about what Hamlet says, nobody came of the undiscovered country. Nobody knows how it is to die. So I read and I translated this poem as a poem about the material feeling of dying. And this is how I understand that probably the idea of mechanical feet is like, I remember my brother, who is a doctor, and we once saw a picture when someone was dying, the feet was going like this, and he said, no, it's not normal. The feet does like this when someone dies. So it's like there's this way of trying to describe what happens to the body, and this is unthinkable. I think that it's very difficult for her to understand and try to translate this idea of how is it actually to die, because we don't know. And this is how I try to translate the poem about this idea of if someone is dying, how can you translate this idea into a poem?
I have tremendous respect for any of you, and I'm sure there are a number here in our audience who have tried to translate this poem into other languages and other cultures. It becomes extremely challenging to do that. And we aren't even sure that it's death that's there. It's something that's like death, death in life, death itself. I don't think we really know. We only know afterward whether somebody is still conscious after this experience. The poem itself doesn't really give us an exit point.
Suzanne, I'm curious, I would be interested to know, since you mentioned formal features, if you have any thoughts about the dialogue that's embedded in the first stanza. And I think we also had a question in chat some time ago regarding thinking about those lines.
Dialogue? I don't know what you mean.
It's in I think that they're, at least in one version, it's in quotations.
Oh, yes. He that
bore, so
Yeah.
that it would appear as though the stiff heart is actually speaking.
is responding to something. And I don't know what that something is, and I totally overlooked it because I didn't know what it was. You can do that. No, I think that something, if I wouldn't know what it is, but it might be some religious text that she's referring to. But that's sheer,
Kimberly asked also that she would love to hear what both of you think about the last two lines of the first stanza and how they connect with the rest of the poem. If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it seems to me it is puzzling. I'm fascinated with how this, I've been interested in how the heart questions, since the heart is not the organ of the body that's capable of questioning or expected to question. Was it he that bore and yesterday, and that's in, or centuries before? That total loss of time here, I think, is very important.
Well, I was trying to point out that actually those two lines and ground or air or ought are also someone who is confused about where he or she is, you know.
Well, no, since, certainly anybody who's been through some tremendous trauma realize that it destroys, it blasts one's sense of time for a while, can't believe it was, the calendar says it was yesterday. It seems as though this has been forever true. It seems as though I just got this word. You can have a lot of disorientation with time.
Yes.
And that's how I see it happening, except that that's not what the heart should be doing. The heart should be keeping time in a steady beat, but instead the heart is stiff and questioning and trying to do the brain's work, which it's incapable of doing.
We have probably time for a couple of more questions. I see Melba Jensen's hand is raised. Melba? Are you there?
Yes, I just dropped this comment into the chat. Elizabeth, when you observed that there's a dialogue going on in stanza 1, it made me think about Emily's comment that she's tended to stumble over the phrase "a wooden way." And I began to wonder if we should read the second stanza as having a counterpoint. The feet mechanical go round, a wooden way, as a sort of a different perspective of ought, ground or air or ought, second voice, regardless groan. It gives me the sense of two voices that are kind of just circling each other, like this O shape that the stanza seems to be talking about.
So again, it all comes, all the comments really come down to the question at the end on the last line. What does letting go mean? Is it good or is it bad? And you don't know, and then you have that dash. And a lot of the comments that people have been making show, kind of that confusion, that I don't know, over the stimulus, whatever. Does that make sense? I don't know.
And the way those last lines use that figure, death by freezing. I'm afraid my early American background, that's how Philip Freneau died. Early poet died freezing in the snow. And this is what one hears, that the real pain is not at the time of death. The real pain is much earlier, because once the person is frozen or near frozen condition, there is no consciousness. And this poem seems to realize that. So if somebody is rescued, and people are rescued from such conditions, then they survive. Perhaps can survive. Others die completely without that person's ability to affect what happens, or probably to have any awareness of whether death is leading into glory or nothingness or hell. One doesn't know. There's no consciousness there.
I see that we're just at the end of the time, and we have so many comments in the chat function that we can't really get to completely, but it's obvious that people are already asking for, Suzanne, your reflection on other poems, like I Cannot Dance Upon My Toes.
Yeah, I've done that one.
It's clear that this is, this has stimulated a lot of wonderful discussion. And I want to thank both of you for just incredible readings and also for your writing, which now we can all turn to, and continue this conversation, I hope, perhaps during the social hour. But please keep the comments coming to both of them, and this will go up onto YouTube, I hope sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Our wonderful audience.
Yes, everyone that would have been up there.
And so now we're
Thank you.
Thank you so much.